Welcome to Y1 Gaming, the Second Wind series. The Second Wind series is an attempt to capture the Path of Exile experience. It's an essay or podcast-like exploration of everything that the game Path of Exile has to offer. My intentions for it is to be something you can listen to on the side, for example while you're playing the game, as well as food for thought that hopefully will lead to an enhanced gaming experience. I'll be exploring many different types of topics such as state of the game, design, the community, a lot of anecdotes, and maybe even conversations with other relevant people. In the best case scenario, the series will inspire people towards playing the game or broaden our perspective on games and our experiences by deconstructing and explaining more abstract aspects such as design philosophy, game balance, or just what it feels like to play Path of Exile. Many Path of Exile players, including me, have experienced Path of Exile burnout, where they actually like the game, but really don't want to play the game anymore. The Second Wind series, as the name suggests, is supposed to be a breath of fresh air, a place where I can collect thoughts, experiences, highlight problems or hurdles with the game, or also maybe start a dialogue with other people, including you, where we can share our ideas. I've noticed for myself, making videos about the game and sharing thoughts about it made playing the game so much more enjoyable. I've been gaming for as long as I can remember, but never before have I tried sharing my gaming experience with other people, except for my close friends. So I've decided for my first attempt on sharing these kinds of things will be this podcast/essay/video series. This being the first episode of the Second Wind series, I thought it's a great opportunity to give you a perspective on what the series is about and how the Second Wind series can be of benefit for you. I personally love listening to podcasts or music while playing the game. The in-game music and sounds are great, but running content over and over again makes listening to audiobooks, podcasts, or music quite soothing, and it makes for a nice change of pace. I will also try to make each episode more about ideas and information rather than a vlog type "what build am I playing" video. Meaning, I'm trying to make content that serves a purpose of knowledge and improvement, as well as a conversation starter or constructive critique for GGG or games in general. I produce music, I like digital art, and in general, I'm a huge fan of creativity. Something that interests me the most is finding connections and parallels between things that seem to be very different from one another. In short, I am a nerd. But let's be real and admit Path of Exile is quite a nerdy game to love, so I suspect that I'm not alone on this one. This brings me to my first topic: complexity versus depth. Is Path of Exile a complex game? You can let me know in the comments whether or not you think the game is complex, and if you agree or disagree with anything I say, you can like or dislike this video to let me know. My inspiration for this video comes from a YouTube video by Nare Sol, a classical pianist, where she talks about the levels of music complexity at the piano. I'll leave a link in the description for those who are interested in music. I'd like to start off by clarifying what those words mean to me and what potential benefit can occur by exploring these concepts. Complexity within a game is the number of factors the player has to track simultaneously. The more variables the player has to track while playing, the more complex the game becomes. Time is a key aspect of complexity. Complexity is not the same as difficulty. A single factor can be very hard to execute or keep track of, while it's possible to look over multiple variables that only require simple observation and can therefore be easier to execute. As an example, for difficulty, I'd take the game Flappy Bird versus an AFK clicker game. Both only require a click on the display to play the game, but for most people, one is harder to execute than the other. This is evidence for me that complexity and difficulty are two different factors. Complexity, however, does share a relationship with difficulty, but is not the sole defining property of it. Why is this important for Path of Exile? And for that, I'd lead with another question, which is, do you think more complexity is good for the game? Looking at the community and the popularity of certain builds, it seems to me like there is an active search for builds that reduce complexity. One-button builds or complete face roll builds seems to be more popular than builds requiring active tracking of cooldowns, positioning, timing, or in short, really complex builds. I want to remind you that popular does not equal everyone. This is why I'm raising the question about complexity. Do you think Path of Exile is a complex game? Are we satisfied with the current level of complexity? In my opinion, Path of Exile is not a very complex game, as the things I usually track while playing the game is the map, using my skills, pressing my flasks, tracking attack queues, and depending on the build, track my resource bars such as life and mana. This means I have to track roughly 5 variables to play the game, 6 if you would count picking up loot, although I'd argue that picking up loot can be done after you've killed everything. We shouldn't forget that time is an important aspect for complexity, and loot normally occurs after the monster has died. This also means setting up your atlas or gearing properly doesn't raise complexity, as you do these things separately. Having a high total number of different factors to track, like skill trees, items, league mechanics, etc. These things I'd rather call depth. The number of factors you handle at the same time is the key point for the complexity, and 5 factors for action-based games doesn't scream high complexity to me. I've noticed that GGG is moving towards having more complex builds by adding things like guard skills or buffing utility skills such as war cries or cursors. However, the player base actively looks for ways to automate these things and tend to stick to less complex builds. It seems to me that I personally enjoy within Path of Exile something like varying complexity. I really want to enjoy action in action RPG, but only within reasonable time frames. I do not want to have to 10-hit combo a white or magic mob. However, holding a single button down the entire game seems to be not the optimal solution as well. Something that is very enjoyable to me about Path of Exile is the depth. When new players play the game, they are somewhat intimidated by things like the passive tree, not even realizing the number of items, mechanics, and modifications that the game has to offer. If complexity is about handling different factors at the same time, depth is something like the total amount of factors and influential mechanics that the game has to offer. This is where Path of Exile becomes exceptional, as it has a lot of depth. Some could even argue maybe we have reached a point where it's too deep, therefore bloated with game mechanics. The Heist League, for example, has introduced even more layers to this by adding the heist mechanic itself with new characters, each with different abilities, and on top of that, added a new layer for support gems, essentially quadrupling the amount of stats they can give, and of course, more new unique items with unique modifiers. I can see how this amount of new content can feel overwhelming for people, but I think it's cool to have new possibilities. However, there is such a thing called analysis paralysis, meaning for people that love optimizing things, there can be a point where they are overwhelmed with the possibilities to the point that they can't actually move forward and play the game because they are stuck trying to decide what to play. I'm bringing up depth and label this topic complexity versus depth because I feel like I've seen people use the word complexity but refer to things I consider being depth, and then following that also mistake depth and complexity for difficulty. If you don't agree with the word choice, feel free to come up with different ones, as long as the essence of the underlying idea is preserved and easy to understand. The difference between handling multiple factors at the same time is different from adding more to the total amount of factors. These things are related to, but not the same as, the quality of factors, such as difficulty. Based on my experience, Path of Exile seems to be heading towards more depth. I'm basing this on the changes to the endgame content GGG has introduced. Back in the day, mapping was the sole endgame, and getting good maps was a luxury. Today, not only has the mapping system evolved, master missions have been changed, scarabs were added, delving became an alternative goal, and more endgame bosses have been added. There isn't really one endgame experience, but rather a fractured one. In the best case scenario, each fraction will feed into another one. Mappers will get more missions and scarabs that can lead to more soulfight and deep delvers. Delvers then collect fossils that crafters and economists use to create more powerful items. These enable even better mappers, which then should create a loop with consistent circulation of items. If I understand this correctly now, fractured fossils are being used to duplicate great heist blueprints. Whenever a new mechanic is introduced, something to keep in mind is the endgame state that flows into one another. Mappers get more scarabs for delvers, delvers get more fractured fossils. For heists, heists should enable more mappers to close off this loop. Having a system like this means that the player then has the option to decide what type of endgame he or she desires to chase. This is a hypothetical scenario where the things feed into one another. I just wanted to remind you that I'm not claiming that this is how the game is. This just seems like what GGG is going for. And if GGG wants to add more depth to the game, these are the things that they will have to think about. So to sum up the video, I define complexity within a game as having a higher amount of factors to keep track of simultaneously. The higher the number, the more complex the game is. Having a higher total amount of relevant factors is what I define as depth, while difficulty being a quality assessment of the factors and therefore different from both complexity and depth. It seems like most people are trying to keep complexity low, but GGG is trying to add more complexity with things like guard skills or the Doom mechanic. This makes me think that what we are looking for is simplicity within a complex game. But what do you think? Are you satisfied with the current state of Path of Exile? Let me know in the comments. Like or dislike the video if you agree or disagree with anything. And subscribe if you want more videos. This is Y1 Gaming with the Second Wind series, and I hope this is helpful.